Okay, so probably the discussion of the book, of Engels' book, is going to be the most boring part of this conversation, or I hope. Because I read parts of it years ago and I barely remember it. I started to reread it for this, but I was like, okay, this is not worth my time. I can answer specific questions about it. I'll try to answer some general questions about it. It's not my area of expertise. My area of expertise in anthropology is egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies, specifically immediate return hunter-gatherer societies. It's not what my master's thesis is on. If you look me up, my master's thesis is on historiography of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is anthropology because the culture of historians is anthropology these days. But what I actually spent most of my time studying before then and since then was egalitarian hunter-gatherers. The reason I didn't do a thesis on it was just because there was no one at the school that I went to at McGill who was an expert on that. And my thesis advisor, who was really cool, was really interested in the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So, if Engels was alive today, he would probably be, and I think what a lot of socialists would be into, and like David Graeber, the book that he just put out, right? I've done I don't expect anybody to see my videos, but I've done a multi-part critique of that book. And what that book is doing is a bit like if people like Marx and Engels were around today, trying to discuss the prospects for an egalitarian society in the future, which is something that we want. We discuss what egalitarian means because every definition in politics is contentious and confused. So, but what's interesting about Engels' book is the part about, primitive communism and future communism. And I don't know about you guys. I'm probably a bit older than most of you guys. But when I was younger, or even until now, the idea, we were always told, and I grew up, during the end of the Cold War, the communism can't work because it's against human nature. Humans are just not capable. It works in theory, but in practice, it doesn't work, which of course you could say about capitalism is total nonsense. But the idea is that human nature is not possible. I don't know if anyone listens to the Lex Friedman podcast. He's an interesting sort of weirdo. He just had on Dr. Richard Wolff, the Marx guy popularizer, and he asked him the question too. He asked him about that, and it's funny because Wolff had a really terrible answer. He didn't know what he was saying, and he sort of blathered on. Like Friedman asked him, "Oh well, the Soviet Union, every communist country turns into a dictatorship, or is a dictatorship, or has been a dictatorship. Why is that? Is there something about human nature that hierarchies?" And he even said, in human nature, if you take any group of people, hierarchy develops naturally. There's people who are more talented and more skilled. You'll hear this stuff all the time, everywhere. Jordan Peterson is a big popularizer of this, but it's in the air and it always has been. And the big idea is that humans are just not capable of egalitarian society. And very few people know that that's just not true. There are many egalitarian societies that we know about. And so Engels was talking about one of them, the Haudenosaunee, I guess he called them Iroquois, which are Native American confederation of various tribes in this area where I live and further south. But there are even much more egalitarian societies than that. But today we wouldn't even call them really an egalitarian society because we have much more egalitarian societies. And those societies which are the most egalitarian, which include gender egalitarianism, but there's some debate on that, those are most likely the types of societies that human beings began. That's our original form of social organization. So when Marx and Engels talk about primitive communism, and when Lewis Henry Morgan was talking about primitive communism, they didn't realize it, but they were talking about immediate return hunter-gatherers, of which they didn't know anything about, and which is most likely, for reasons that I can explain if you want to get into that, our original form of human social organization. And one of the reasons that I get so pissed off at the David Graeber book is because my whole life we've been telling us, well, egalitarianism is against human nature. And then we have all of these reasons to see that. First of all, we know that it can work because we have examples of it. And we also have very good reason, we don't know for sure, obviously, to think that this is our original form of human society. So there might be some evolutionary psychology types of arguments that actually mean that egalitarian organization is maybe the thing that we're best adapted to. And I'll talk a bit about that as we I'll talk a bit about that as we go. But so I was pissed off at Graeber because he's just trying to make this argument that no, we weren't egalitarians to begin with, and the whole idea of egalitarianism is childish and insulting to different Aboriginal peoples. And he's trying to argue against the idea that some people have brought up a small group of people who are aware of anthropology, when these egalitarian societies are brought up, they'll say, well, that was nice back in the past, but that's not possible in the future. So he's sort of arguing with those people. He's making a popular book geared towards the average person. But in my understanding, the average person doesn't even know there's such thing as any egalitarian societies. They think that, well, egalitarianism isn't possible for human beings. It's against our nature. And he's writing a popular book for the mass public. But in the end, he's countering ideas that only an elite of people have. And in doing so, he's reinforcing the idea that egalitarian societies aren't possible. And he's spitting and obfuscating all the data and reasons that we have for believing that they are possible and that they are potentially most likely our original form of society. So I don't know if you guys read the Graeber book or anything about that, but that's why I spend so much time.
No, I've listened to your critiques, to yours and any other critiques of it. And I feel like I've gotten the gist of it.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. The book is fun. Like I recommend reading the book, but just got to read the critiques too, or else you're just going to, your head's going to be twisted into a pretzel. So yeah, so if you want to get into the questions that they have about the book, I'll get into those, according to what knowledge I have. And then hopefully we'll spin off from that and get into more interesting stuff, relevant stuff to us. Because I think we're all, past having a bad time. Well, maybe you'll be more pumped if you, know more about the prospects for an egalitarian future, or at least the egalitarian past. And I'll talk a bit about what Engels got right and got wrong. As far as I know, not having read the book anytime soon, I don't think I ever read the full book, etc.
Great.
So
So I'll try to explain this question as best clarify it as best as I can, giving us a summary of what kind of updates have been made to anthropological theory since the time of Engels' writing, specifically when it comes to our understanding and the structure of primitive and indigenous societies. Because what stuck with me was the stuff that I didn't know how to parse was like the stuff about the Iroquois and these like American tribes, and I actually just reread that, and I'll read a little bit of like kind of what I'm talking about at the end of the.
Give me specific because it's too.
At the end of the third section, the Iroquois gens, the last paragraph.
Also, gents. Oh, sorry. I'll let you.
No, go ahead.
Just because he talks about the gents and the gentes so there's tribes and clans, there's ethnic groups, and everybody always mixes up all these things, including anthropologists, especially earlier anthropologists. So I want to give some shape to these words, and it's hard because people use them in conflicting ways. But basically, so your broader group is going to be an ethnic group, which is people who believe that they have a common descent and that they share a common culture. We're not going to get a definition of culture. Then inside that, you might have, for some groups, tribes. Tribes are descent groups where people are believed to be descended from a common ancestor, usually a fictional ancestor. And it could be a human, it could be a bear. There's the bear tribe, the snake tribe. There's all kinds of tribes where we are all descendants of this great snake ancestor.
And this gets into the second question a little bit too, like Engels' stagist view, like these things are inevitable and that anyway, I'm just going to read this and then maybe try to formulate my question better. But we must not forget that this organization was doomed. It did not go beyond the tribe. The Confederacy of Tribes already marks the beginning of its collapse, as will soon be apparent, and was already apparent in the attempts at subjugation by the Iroquois. Outside the tribe was outside the law. Wherever there was not an explicit treaty of peace, tribe was at war with tribe, and wars were waged with the cruelty which distinguishes men from other animals, and which was only mitigated later by self-interest. The Gentile constitution in its best days, as we saw it in America, presupposed an extremely undeveloped state of production and therefore an extremely sparse population over a wide area. So what I think what I want to understand better is like what are the material conditions that led to these types of formations, and what kinds of updates have there been to this to what you've seen of Engels, what you've read of
Engels' work? So what you just talked about. So there's a lot to unpack there, and it's a bit separate from, because you mentioned that unilingual stages of development, right? And that's Lewis Henry Morgan and Marx, and let's talk about that too. That's sort of separate from what you're talking about, but that's something that we should really talk about, because that's something that's clearly, I can easily talk about, that's outdated. Now, from what I understand, what we just said, what Engels is talking about, the Gentile system, he's talking about the tribal system, and another word for that is segmented lineage society, meaning you have equal groups, you have these sort of egalitarian groups in a hierarchy of larger and larger groups. So, you have your nuclear family, and then each clan is made up of several nuclear families from a common ancestor who's living or recently dead within living memory. And then each clan has, it's a tribe. It's what I just described before. And so if you want to talk about what are the material conditions that lead to that form of organization, and so it was assumed, and I think it might be assumed by Engels and Marx in that text, so I'm not sure. If I'm wrong, correct me. But it's often been assumed, and you'll see that in contemporary literature where they talk about ancient tribes and tribal organization and how violent it is. So he's saying that tribal organization is inherently conflictual. Tribes are constantly warring with each other. And that's generally true. I mean, it just depends on the situation, but that's typical. If you look at, I guess, the Bible, agro-pastoralists. Anyhow, there's like the common Bedouin saying, which is me against my brother and I against my cousin, my brother and I against the outsider. So it's these groups and that's a very pastoralist type of slogan. Pastoralists are cattle herders. They're almost always organized into tribal organization. And basically you are trying to steal your brother's cattle. He's trying to steal your cattle, you and your brother. But as soon as you're faced with an outside enemy that's less related to you, you join up with all your closer related people units, whether they're nuclear families, clans, or tribes, to fight against an outside group. So you might be fighting against an outside family if it's you against your brother. You and your brother you might be fighting against your cousin's clan. Your tribe might be fighting an outside tribe, and the confederation or the collection of tribes might be fighting against another ethnic group. And so tribal organization is not our original form of organization, or likely isn't. Tribal organization is the product of needing to defend and control resources or territory. Okay, so for pastoralists, like the ancient Hebrews in the Bible, the early part of the Old Testament, the property is, because they're nomadic people and they're not so controlling territory, but they're more controlling of their herds of animals. But for people like the Haudenosaunee, who are more sedentary, they're not completely sedentary, these are lands that they are controlling, farm agricultural lands, hunting territories. And as populations increase, there's more and more competition. Originally, people were hunter-gatherers. Once we get into farming, populations grow much faster, and the need for land and the settlement versus nomadism, the need for land grows and grows as your population grows. And there's this endless conflict, endless war. Not everywhere, depends on the situation, but in the situation that Marx is talking about, the North American situation, you had, and at the stage that he's talking about, you had these different tribes who had organized into a confederation of tribes against a competing confederation of tribes. So you had the Iroquois, which is Haudenosaunee, and they united against another confederation of tribes, the Wendat. And the Wendat tribes and the Iroquois tribes were very, very similar in many, many ways. Each tribe is a little bit different. Each confederation is a little bit different, but they had so many, even though they're blood enemies, they're, you would look at them and think that they're basically the same in many of their forms of organization and even their beliefs and values. I forget where I'm going with this. What do you want to get out of this question? So why does that exist? That exists because tribal organization is a means of controlling territory. So the reason, and tribes tend to be gerontocratic, and the reason is because, we have this piece of land that we all depend on to live. How are we going to manage it, right? Well, the easiest way is, because we're reproducing on this piece of land, we're keeping it within the family. And how do you parcel out authority within a family? It's especially when it's a descent group, it's easier to makes most sense to parcel the authority to the oldest living member because he is or she is the person that everyone has in common beneath that person. So we are all the grandchildren of this person, or the great grandchildren of this person, or the great descendants of this great snake or bear or whatever it is, right? So we give authority to the oldest person. That's the logic of tribal stuff. And tribes tend, not always, but towards war, because the whole reason they exist is to defend and manage property against others. So if you have tribes, that's a sign that there's probably conflict and resource scarce, territorial scarcity, etc. Now, the reason I say that it's not our original form of organization is because when you look at egalitarian hunter-gatherers, when you look at hunter-gatherers in general, some of them are organized tribally, but a lot of them aren't. And the ones that many anthropologists think most resemble our earliest ancestors are not very territorial. They're a little bit territorial, but they basically let whoever wants come in and use the territory. In times of scarcity, they have these sort of tribal and clan organizations that suddenly they're dormant. People don't really pay much attention to them. But when there's scarcity times, these things will come into action. Like Colin Turnbull noticed, he didn't even notice that he didn't know that there was a clan or a tribal system in the Moody Pygmies that he was studying. And then he found that in the men's, there's often gendered organizations. And he found some symbols that an old man was guarding. And he asked about it. And it turns out that these were clan totems. And basically it turns out that many of these egalitarian hunter-gatherers who are not organized tribally have these sort of dormant systems that spring into action when there's a drought. We need to restrict access to who can get our water holes. Well, we're going to let people from this clan or this, tribe in and not others. But in general, hunter-gatherers are nomadic. Anyone can use the land. If it's not a scarcity time, there's no need for territorialism. Therefore, there's no need for tribalism. There's no need for everyone sticking around with their relatives. We just go wherever we want to go. And as a result, and I'll talk about this later, because egalitarian hunter-gatherer society resembles, in interesting ways, modern urban society. In obviously not in every way, but in ways that are really interesting. If we think about like a return to civilization, the future socialism is going to resemble primitive communism. Well, here are some of the seeds of that, and here are some of the hints of that. Egalitarian hunter-gatherers and modern urban people resemble each other in certain ways that are different from most other societies. We'll talk about that a bit later, but I don't know. It's a whole bunch of stuff.
That's great.
Pull on any of those threads or whatever. Get back to the book, whatever you want. Yeah.
No, it's great. Now keep pulling those threads and go off in the direction you see fit. Jim, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'll do my requisite thing and make everything about history as usual. Yeah, I'm in Western New York, which is Seneca land, or where I am is Seneca land, I guess, and also the land of Lewis Henry Morgan. So I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about Morgan's influence, right? Obviously, in Engels' time, this was cutting edge. I use this term very loosely, science, but it's long been surpassed. In particular, I was actually thinking back on the reading and Engels' sort of conviction that there is a sort of globally applicable series of stages, and wondering whether that was more a result of his encounter with Morgan than his sort of historical materialist approach to history. And kind of as a follow-up from that, I also kind of recognized in some of Morgan's schema a similarity between that and some of the stuff you see in the philosophy of history around this time, right? And particularly Arnold Toynbee's sort of ideas about civilization and this sort of sequencing of events. And also, a lot of the lexicon around like, such and such a place is, quote, backwards, such and such a place is, quote, advanced, etc. So just wondering if Morgan is kind of someone you see as being particularly influential in kind of spreading this, and to what extent would you attribute the way Engels kind of dives into this to his excitement about Morgan, and to what extent you think it flows naturally from historical materialism?
Okay, yes. There's a lot to get into here, and if I forget to address something, just remind me. And I'm not a historian, of course, of this period, so like you might know more about some of this than me. Barn might know more than some of the others, but I do have something to say about it. So that 19th century is the time of the colonial era, right? And it's the time of urbanization in North America and in the United States, where there's more and more, and in other places around the world, there are these closer and closer encounters of the civilized colonial countries with various ethnic groups that they want to take their land, subjugate them in various ways, etc. And when people who have very advanced technology and superior military power encounter weaker people, and these are people always who value strength and power and their civilizational values, are encountering weaker people, especially if they want to take over these people, you're going to have to justify that in terms of superiority, etc. And without having any in-depth knowledge, all the knowledge they have of different countries are just travelers' accounts. There's Arab accounts from the 14th century. There's Herodotus, Greek accounts, ancient Roman accounts. They don't know that much about the patterns of different societies around the world. There's not great telecommunications. It's very easy to say, well, we're superior and they're inferior. And there's a lot of that in the air. But we have to be careful because those are popular ideas. So like those unilateral stages of evolution, which to us imply superiority and inferiority in terms of intelligence and morality and stuff like that. That is, of course, it's a product of the 19th century, also 20th century, but it's more of a popular conception than the actual anthropologists and different scholars and writers at the time had in their hand. Even someone like Herbert Spencer, you guys know Herbert Spencer, he's known as a social Darwinist, survival of the fittest, and applying Darwinism to human societies. Even if you read his stuff, and it's in a lot of ways very right-wing stuff, he's not really saying that, well, we need to have survival of the fittest, like we need capitalism because we want the strong to wipe out the weak and the inferior should die out. His argument is that, well, if we coddle the weak, well, they're weak because their social habits are bad. And if we make life easy for them, they're going to continue their bad habits and then they're going to remain weak. If we subject them to the market and this and that, that'll make them stronger and better and make everybody better. So a lot of the sort of caricatures that we have of social, I'm not advocating social Darwinism in any way or shape or form. I'm just saying that these sorts of ideas are ideas that we've sort of back projected into this. So a lot of it is, so Lewis Henry Morton came up with his stages, but also did, what's his face, E.B. Tyler. These are ideas that were in the air at the time and had a lot to do, I'm pretty sure, with the colonial encounters at that time. And the discipline of anthropology, and yeah, Morgan is hugely influential in the discipline of anthropology. And one of his big innovations was, instead of just sitting around talking about stuff and reading about various scraps from ancient books of travel accounts, which are very sensationalized, he went and spent a lot of time with the Seneca, right, who were part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And he was adopted among their ranks. And he was the first, what we call in anthropology, participant observer, where, today the tradition is, and it's been for 100 years, we go and you're supposed to live with whoever you're studying for supposed to be no less than 3 years. And then it's been whittled down because of, whatever, administrative reasons. And the only way you're going to understand people is to be one of them for a certain amount of time. And then you reserve judgment. Like you go look at certain people and you're like, oh, they're doing this horrible savage thing and this ridiculous thing and this sexist thing and this whatever thing. Well, you want to put aside those, your cultural prejudices from your point of view and go plunge yourself in the culture of the other and understand it from their point of view before you can come back and make any kinds of judgments on them. So he was sort of the first person to do that in a academic profession type of context. And Marx and Engels were very taken with his work in part, and he wasn't. It's interesting because Morgan wasn't like a socialist, but he did. For example, there's a quote which maybe you read, it's in the book, where he basically says, all of this obsession with property that we have today in civilization, that's not the ultimate end of humanity. Like it's kind of like pathetic and dirty. Like we're going to transcend that, and we're going to end up back at I forget if he says, so the liberté, fraternité, and égalité enjoyed by the Iroquois gentes. So he even had like a vision of the future that was similar to Marx and Engels, although his idea was more bourgeois than Marx and Engels' vision was going to be. But what they liked about his thesis or his book was that it gave sort of, not exactly the same way that Marx would, but material it was scholarship that gave material reasons for the different stages of cultures. And it sort of lent itself that sort of the stages of cultural evolution lend themselves to Marx's vision of, going from primitive communism, slavery, serfdom, whatever, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. I'm probably mangling all of this stuff, but giving a sort of general idea. So they got some of their ideas and from Morgan, but they also took them to a different place that we're more familiar with today. A lot of Morgan's ideas are a bit more wishy-washy. Like Morgan's basic idea was that people were, it's discoveries. Like, so he was explaining the different levels. So to Morgan, there's different unilineal evolution. Every people has gone through similar stages, right? And what happens, and the reason that some people are still in the primitive stage of barbarism stage or lower barbarism or upper barbarism, and we're in civilization, is because of technological discoveries. Now, he doesn't attribute, he had a lot of respect for the Seneca. So he doesn't attribute these discoveries to some great human geniuses and that this race is better than that race. He was specifically anti-racist in that sense. He believed that the discoveries advanced, but he did believe in what he believed in that we no longer believe in, of course, is that a lower stage, because we could still, there are still social evolution, cultural evolutionists who will talk about sort of lower and higher stages, but they're talking about complexity. They're not talking about better. Like when he's talking about lower and higher, there's an implication that this is better. He assumes that civilization is better than upper barbarism of the Iroquois, and that upper barbarism is better than the middle barbarism and the lower barbarism of the Bedouin and of the savagery of hunter-gatherers, right? And that the discovery of new technologies is what allows these people to better themselves and even causes their brains to grow. Like the brain grows once we are, allowed to feed ourselves more through our great technologies and this and that. So that stuff is all in the toilet. We don't agree with any of that stuff. Where we still do hold on to a lot of what Lewis and Engels was talking about was that, and this is controversial, like anthropology has turned into a giant postmodernist shit show in a lot of ways. So a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is stuff that you won't learn today. It depends where you go to school, but in a lot of schools, you'll go through your BA and your master's degree, and you won't learn like 70% of the stuff I'm talking about. It's kind of depressing, and it takes away your ability to understand what's going on, why things exist. Like all that stuff I explained about tribes and why tribes exist as a organization to defend territory. I didn't learn that in school. I learned that on my own, reading historical and recent anthropology. Okay. There's a book I think called Warless Societies, where he specifically gets into segmented lineage from 10, 15 years ago. Anyways, we also have anthropology PhDs who have no idea, who are like, oh, wow, that's really interesting. When I went to school, I was like 35 and everyone else was like 25. And I would talk about some of this stuff and people were like, wow, that's really cool. I'm like, why don't you know this stuff? Because they don't teach it. They're teaching a lot of postmodernist stuff, which has some value, but which I find most of it as dubious value. So where was I going? Fuck, what's the last thing I said before I went on that tangent about academia? Anybody remember?
You were well, I think maybe I'm going back a little farther, but you were touching on the stages question.
Okay. So where there are still people who, so what we still retain, or those of us who still have a material, view of reality, there are some, so societies do not progress from one stage to another in order to get better and better. The different stages, the different form, because we see these same forms. Now, it made sense what he was seeing, but what he was seeing is, so there are these tribes in, New York who have this form of social organization. And if I go look at ancient Greece, well, there's a lot of similarities in what I'm reading in some of these ancient Greek texts. And if I look at, I could look at the Bible, for example, 5,000 years ago, the ancient Hebrews, and I could look at the Nuer, like that book that was written in the 1950s by E. Evans Pritchard, and I'm like, whoa, this is exactly the same stuff. You have the same form of social organization, you have the same patriarchy, you have a lot of the same belief systems, even though they don't ancient Hebrews were monotheistic. There's just the amount of similarities is incredible across 5,000 years of time. And I guess, well, it's not a huge geographical expanse from Sudan to Israel, but you have things that are North America to ancient Greece. You have things, giant expanses of time and space, and we see similar patterns. So Lewis Henry Morgan and his contemporaries thought, and these must be stages that everyone goes through. Simplest, like the hunter-gatherer, and then we go to pastoralism, which is a form of hunting-gathering, which is a nomadic form of social organization. But we have property, and then there's like primitive farming, and whatever, up in these stages of complexity. Now we know that stuff's not true because people go back and forth to different forms of social organization, and it's like evolution. Like the popular view of evolution is we're getting smarter and smarter and better, right? But we're not getting smarter and smarter, better and better. We're getting more adapted to whatever our situation is. So, 50 years ago, people were probably stronger, right? Physical strength is good. I think we all agree that having a bad back and having back pains and not being able to walk isn't good. But it's something that we have more of today because we're probably weaker today. Or a dentist, having bad teeth is not adaptive. Now, okay, I guess I should put this in an evolutionary context. But anyways, the point is that being smarter can be more adaptive in certain situations, but it's maladaptive in other situations because having such a huge, great brain takes up an enormous amount of resources and it'll kill you if you don't need that great brain, And if you're in a certain type of environment that you'll be selected against for being too smart. Like, I imagine certain kind of serfs or like really servile labor, like the smartest people probably all committed suicide at some point or couldn't, hack the, living in a hut and staying in the same place, or not necessarily intelligent people, but some people have more of a disposition to need change and variety. Well, if you're stuck in one place your whole life, you might want to commit suicide. You could be somebody else and who likes to be in one place all the time. Anyways, I'm just going all over the place. I'm talking about a lot of evolutionary psychology, which people don't like, but which I believe in a left-wing way. I forget where I'm going again, but so social complexity. But the fact is, you can't get to civilization without going from hunting and gathering to certain kinds of agriculture, to certain other kinds of forms of agriculture, to certain kinds of states to get, basically there is some kind of linear evolution if you want to get somewhere. So you can't have a car unless you built a wheel first, you can't, unless you've discovered petroleum and unless you've discovered gas or electricity. You can't get to one thing without another thing, but there is not a linear progress that everybody has to go through. People go back and forth. People often abandon farming and go to hunting and gathering because it's just more fun and better if they can in certain circumstances. We've seen that happen many times, and people go in the other direction many times. But what we still keep of, so cultural evolution today is about, just like genetic evolution, it's not about getting bigger and stronger and smarter. It's about how do we adapt to our situation. So cultural evolution is, this culture went from being pastoralists to being hunter-gatherers because that was a better adaptation. This society became more complex because of the circumstances and because that was an adaptation. And sometimes we think too much about adaptation. We forget about circumstances and bargaining power. So when you read about hierarchy and stratified societies, you'll read a lot of the talk is about, it's just more efficient to have a hierarchy because that way things get done better. The pharaoh tells everyone to build the pyramid gets done. Everybody has equal authority. They're all bickering and there's no pyramid getting done. But at the end of the day, you can't have a hierarchy without having an inequality of bargaining power. If circumstances don't give anyone an advantage with which to bully other people around, no one's going to be like, slavery is more efficient than, just chaos. So I'm going to be a slave. Nobody wants to be a slave. Everybody wants to have some autonomy. And when you see hierarchy, there's some kind of conditions that result in unequal bargaining power, which allow that hierarchy to exist. Except in some circumstances where people will choose to be in a hierarchy, but those hierarchies are much less stable and they're much less tyrannical because people just won't accept being abused. Okay, I went off in 50 directions. Did I miss anything in your question?
I think you covered everything and then some.
Okay. All right.
I have more questions, but I actually wanted to open the floor. I think Jeremy had a quick question, actually, if you wanted to just jump in.
You mentioned a recommendation that was linked earlier, but I listened to the Matt Crispin kind of review of the Graeber book, and I think you even mentioned it in 10.2, where you're like, can somebody point this at him? I guess my question is, what would you recommend instead of this Graeber book? Because it certainly had concepts that I was interested in. But listening to your podcast made me think, well, a lot of the things that made me buy into their idea are things that they may have twisted or misrepresented. So if you have any recommendations, please.
Unfortunately, there's no good, people ask me this all the time. And as far as I know, and my knowledge is incomplete, there's no good book that does what Graeber and Wengrow are doing, but correctly. I think their book is so full of shit and so fucked up in so many ways, but you have to give them that credit. They're tackling something that is necessary, that is important, especially if you're some kind of socialist left, and that nobody has really taken a stab at. They fucked it up. They didn't have to. They fucked it up on purpose in a way. But there's no good thing. So that's why I'm spending so much time doing this damn thing, and to wank myself off. The best alternative to the David Graeber is my critique of the David Graeber, which I'm using as a springboard to sort of bring together all kinds of stuff I've been reading over the years into like a coherent counter narrative to what Graeber is saying. But if you want to read, because who the fuck am I? Don't trust what I'm saying. Like, really don't. Like, if you have the time, for entertainment value, sure. Trust, believe whatever you want. Believe whatever fad diet you want. Believe everything. But I'm giving a lot. In every episode, I have a whole bibliography. Dive into that stuff. Maybe you want to start. An easy place to start is this text called, I think, Egalitarian Social Organization by Jerome Lewis. Just an introduction to the fact that egalitarian societies exist and how they sort of work. And that'll blow your mind. And then you can just go from the bibliography from there. Or look at my podcast or the videos and just look at the bibliography. You'll find a whole bunch of stuff there. But unfortunately, there's no great thing. Maybe I'll try to write something, like when I finish this, I'll turn it into something, and not talk so much about the book, but just talk about, let's talk about the prospects for the future and why.
Yeah, you definitely. I listened to the Part of Science Today at work, and I will definitely be adding you to my podcast rotation. I really like the podcast.
Awesome, thank you. Okay.
See, Derek Varn, did you want to make a suggestion?
Yeah, if I was going to suggest that you guys read anything in addition other than the bibliography that Daniel did, because I think I've been reading in Daniel's bibliography for a while. I think Marshall Solins' early work, Stone Age Economics, is good. Avoid Solins' late work. Stick with his early work. And then I might actually, for a counterpoint, but it's still fairly materialist, I might read Six Societies. I'm trying to remember who wrote that book. It's very unpopular. Yeah, it's very unpopular amongst leftists, but I think it's super important and is a good counterweight to the Graeberite. Everybody can be healthy and do everything under any material conditions because they think so. Not to be uncharitable, but to be uncharitable. And I'll turn it back over to Daniel.
So let me talk about Six Societies, because I actually recommend that book. I wouldn't recommend that first. Like, that's Six Societies is when you read a lot of egalitarian stuff and you get so pumped up and you want to just a little bit come down to earth, because and what Graeber was reacting to, the reason he hates, it's complicated to get into, but I'm convinced he hates the idea of egalitarian societies because he learned about them from hippie professors in the 70s and 80s, and they were probably talking about them in a really obnoxious way that treated them like little Smurfs. And so he reacted against that and then just never really dove into the literature of it until like a year before he died, when he published a couple of preview articles about his book. And then a lot of anthropologists who study egalitarian society got really pissed off. And I think he read that literature for the first time probably since he was like 20, and then kind of crammed it into his book in a really clumsy way because it kind of contradicts everything he says before and after the chapter where he talks about it. But anyhow, so Six Societies is a book, and the premise of this book is we all, in popular discourse, we have this idea that, the tribal people, the ancient people, they know they're so much more in tune with nature. They do everything right. They eat better food. They have better habits. They have better ways of dealing with sex, and blah, blah. He's like, no, there's all kinds of miserable fucking people in all kinds of societies. And let's look at them and see how dysfunctional all of these societies are. Now, the thing to keep in mind, if you want to keep your utopianism going is that, so the hyper-egalitarian societies that we are very interested in, because they resemble the most the communist or anarchist societies that we want to live in, are called immediate return hunter-gatherers. And these are a set of societies who you can find them, some in the Kalahari Desert, some in the rainforests of the Congo, some in the mountainous forests of India, near the Himalayas, some in eastern Tanzania, and historically, most likely the Montagnais and Scapi people in North America were immediate return hunter-gatherers. And I think there might be a couple of others I'm forgetting here and there. But all of these societies, across various completely different ecologies and thousands of miles and hundreds of years apart, have an enormous amount of things in common. And those things in common include gender equality, or the closest thing that we've ever seen on this planet, freedom of movement, lack of any positions of permanent authority, no chiefs, no religious figures with any authority, no anybody with any authority besides what authority people feel like investing in them at the moment. The typical authority figure that exists at all is your mom. And also, when you go on a hunting trip, the boys will pick, although it can be the girls too in some of the groups, depending on what kind of hunting they do, will pick somebody to be their party leader for the duration of the trip. And that leader will have a bit more authority if it's a dangerous type of hunting gathering, and less, or even they won't even appoint one in different ways. But it's like having, you have your music band, or your sports team, you have a leader, but the authority disappears as soon as you finish your band rehearsal. The band leader is just Joe Schmo. You don't follow him around and carry his bags for him. So these are like the actual anarcho communist societies, and we have a bunch of reasons, which I can talk about maybe later, why we think that human beings began like this. And there's a lot of evidence. There's genetic evidence, which sounds weird, but there is, and there's I don't know, demographic evidence and other stuff like that. So 6 societies. Just keep in mind when you read this Debbie Downer book that they're not shitting. I don't think they shit on those societies at all. They might mention one here or there a little bit, but you'll find very little to complain about in those societies. And the sort of evolutionary psych, like the idea that, well, we have so many problems with sugar and fat because we live these lifestyles that are very different from what we are evolved to do. Right? This is uncontroversial evolutionary psych. I mean, maybe there's somebody arguing that that's not true, but most of us accept that on some level. So the corollary of that is that, well, we are evolved to exist in these relatively egalitarian circumstances, and we don't do well in hierarchical circumstances. And one of the early theories of not early, but like in the 1960s, there's an article about depression where it was theorized that depression is actually a evolutionary response to hierarchy. And you can see this, if you hear Jordan Peterson talk about lobsters, sometimes they're talking about, you'll have a conflict for dominance, and then one person loses. And when they lose, they kind of show the symptoms, not person, like one animal shows symptoms of depression. And that way they just accept the loss and they sort of adjust, and then they sort of continue in their lowered status. But in humans, you're not supposed to ever be in a subordinate position for very long. So being in a subordinate position for very long, like being an office worker with a boss all day, can lead to depression. Now that's a controversial theory, but anyways, I forget what you guys go on to this. I think that the thirst for wealth and for power exists because in the setting, and we'll talk about why are these societies egalitarian. It's something that we really want to study, and which Weber doesn't do in his book. Why do these societies exist? How are they egalitarian? How are men and women equal? I thought, men are supposed to be able to dominate women. Aren't men stronger than women? Can't we beat them up? Like, why? How do they end up having equality? Are they just nice people? Are they so great? Are they just like so enlightened that the dudes are all super feminist guys? No, there are material conditions that generate that egalitarian form of social organization. So it's something that we want to study. If in the future we want to organize some kind of egalitarian society with all the civilization that we sort of need to maintain the giant populations that we have, how are we going to, what do we do to maintain, to keep an egalitarian social organization so that some elite doesn't come and dominate everyone else over time. Even look at something like social democracy. Those societies start to unravel over time because big elites, even, you can even look at Sweden, that systems are unraveling because certain big elites were given preferential treatment in various ways by the state, and they just sort of hog it over time and end up swallowing. The egalitarianism is only tolerated for so long when you have people big enough to fight against it. In the US, you saw that in this dramatic fashion. After World War II, after the Great Depression, you have this relatively egalitarian social order, and it unravels very quickly after the 70s because you have people in positions to do so. But then you have these egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies for tens, possibly tens of thousands of years, who seem to maintain this egalitarian social structure. How do they maintain that? Why do they? What are the conditions that allow men and women to be equal, etc.? So I just went off in 15 different directions, but hopefully that's some of that stuff.
That's great. That answered a lot of questions on our list. I think me and Jim have asked a few questions. I want to open it up and see if anybody else in the room has one.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely curious, Daniel. You mentioned at the beginning, there's a lot of similarities in your view between these immediate return hunter-gatherer societies and urban humans. And I'm curious if you could go into that a bit.
Actually, you know what? I've been taking a list of this. People ask me all this time, and it's important for a video I'm going to do in the future. So I've been sort of taking notes. Let me just open my document and find it. Urban hunter-gatherers and urban life. Now, this is it might not sound that interesting, but maybe if I get into it. We don't have tribal I'll just give a list of things, and they might not seem interesting, but I could talk about them more. Sexual permissiveness, since the 60s, since the pill, basically we have much more sexual permissiveness than we did before. Although there's some, there's different periods in history that had more, the 1920s in certain parts were very sexually promiscuous compared to the 50s. But compared to most traditional societies, or many traditional societies, we have a level of sexual permissiveness that they divorce, serial monogamy that we have, it resembles the serial monogamy of immediate return hunter-gatherers. You have a partner for a few years, you might break up and then go have another partner. Even now, some of the weird polyamory stuff, which most people who see that is just it seems like demented and pathological, and a lot of those people are miserable. You see some of that in some of these immediate return societies. There's interesting articles about that. The lack of religious dogma, right? Most traditional societies, again, but it depends on kind, but the kind we tend to be familiar with, like the big religions and stuff, and a lot of other kinds have, very religious, have a lot of religious dogma. Modern urban people and immediate return hunter-gatherers have a very loose relationship to religion. So, if you looked at the Hadza in Tanzania, people have written several articles where they argue that the Hadza have no religion. I don't think that's correct, but you ask a Hadza person, what happens after you die? And he'll say typically we bury you, we cry, and then we go away. Well, what happens to your soul? And they're like, I don't know. How am I supposed to know that? Some people think you go to the sun, but I don't know. They have, that's the idea that a lot of us have, right? We think in a similar way. Or, gender equality, we don't have exactly gender equality today, but we have made giant advances in gender equality in the last, since the 70s. And these societies have even more gender equality than we have. We have fluid social composition. We have nuclear families and fluid social composition. We don't trace our lineages very carefully. Even more and more, last names don't matter, right? We used to take our father's last name. There was practical reasons for that. We don't do that anymore. Everyone has these hyphenated names or whatever. We use, there's different kinds of family kinship terms. This used to be a big field in anthropology where we, so in a lot of cultures, we have our uncle. So if your father's brother and your mother's brother are both called your uncle, and even a lot of people that that aren't related to you are called your uncle, if they're family friends, right? That's how hunter-gatherers do. That's called Eskimo kinship. But there are other kinds of kinship, and Eskimo kinship is actually not that common. Many cultures will differentiate between mother's brother and father's brother, and this person and that person. They have all kinds of different family terms. In urban society, and especially now with social networks, we have, although at the same time, like you're talking about Robert Putnam, our social networks are shrinking, but we tend to have larger groups, larger, what is it? Maybe I'm wrong with it. In a sense, larger social networks. In our lives, we interact with thousands of people or more, and we maintain relationships, although, yeah, we're really losing that. But most traditional societies have a parochial sphere of networks. They might have large social networks, but everybody lives within a 20-mile radius. But we have 1,000. So us, for example, we're all over the place, and we have friends in different continents, different places. Well, immediate return hunter-gatherers, from what we can tell from archaeology, had giant social networks spanning continents, and a person would know thousands of people over their lifetime. Which is not what we think, but that is how it is. I don't know. So
you're making it sound very, very good that we have these, our social order is changing so much to look like this. Why does it feel like just a total lack of meaningful social ties or meaningful?
Yes. So yeah. It's not like a lot of this stuff is decay and disaster. And I guess Marx would say, capitalism needs to destroy things to build, new things. And some of it is that. But how do I I haven't written this episode yet, so I haven't thought this is half-baked stuff. This is class analysis too, like among artists, right? I know a lot of artists, like I'm from an arts background. People are very naturally inclined towards socialism and anarchism and communism because they just want to do their thing and they don't care, they're happy to share. They don't want any lavish stuff. They don't care about having property. They just, I can live in a communal house like that. It's a natural instinct to think that way. And more, I know it sounds antithetical because everyone is so greedy and so narrow-minded and so selfish, but capitalism, okay, the reason that hunter-gatherers have these egalitarian values and egalitarian social structure has a lot to do, and David Graeber takes a stab at it, but he sort of fucks it up because he has it backwards. David Graeber points to that the societies that we want have freedom to move, freedom to disobey, and there's something else there too. Freedom to choose your political system or something, or your leaders. And the thing is that the material conditions are what generate that stuff. And us in this period, especially in this welfare state period, but it's fraying, like what I'm talking about could disappear, right? In 20 years, if we end up like in a more feudalist type of society, and we're heading in that direction. But okay, there's a book called Sex Under Socialism, or Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. And the idea is that so the woman compares East and West Germany, right? Because they're the same culture, they basically have the same material conditions, but the difference is that after 1948 or whatever, they have two different political and economic systems. And in the East, women have access. There's welfare, there's child support, there's all this stuff. And in the West, they don't have it. And what they discover is that women are much more independent. Women are much more focused in a relationship on having a Kristen Gotzi example, on having a good orgasm. They want a lover who's nice to them and who knows how to do things, in the bedroom, and they're more likely to drop a guy. But in the West, people need to make a living. You can fall into poverty. Having a child, out of wedlock can be like a catastrophe sentence. So women are looking for guys who are strong, guys who are this, guys who are that. So because we've had a welfare state, our society, and because of various aspects of capitalism, but especially the welfare state, our society ends up having some of the material conditions that resemble immediate return hunter-gatherers. If you ever hung out with a lot of squeegee kids, like homeless street kids, like usually are addicted to heroin or other drugs, and immediate return hunter-gatherers are not addicted to heroin, but some of the conditions of their lives, they tend to have the same kind of social structure. They share anything called demand sharing. Anything that you get, you have to share with all your friends. Okay. And the way that you avoid sharing it with your friends is just to hide it, and you'll see that same practice in street kids here than you'll see in immediate return hunter-gatherer societies. Now, I know I'm talking all over the place. I'm just saying that the welfare state in particular, there's a guy, okay, you know this pickup artist? His name is Roosh B. You ever hear of this guy? He's this gross fucking, right? He's disgusting. Yeah. Like you guys are like an vomit in your mouth. Okay. So he's a disgusting prick. He's basically a rape artist, and he's writing these books, and he writes all these books on bang France, bang Iceland, bang Scotland. It's about how do you have sex? How do you manipulate women in all of these cultures, right? He has a book. When he wrote about Denmark, his book is called Don't Bang Denmark. Now, why don't you bang Denmark? The reason you don't bang Denmark is, and he goes on, all the girls are so ugly and they're so gross. But when you get into it, what actually the reason you don't bang Denmark is because none of his manipulation tricks work on any of the women in Denmark. And he blames it on socialism, and he's correct, because they have great child support, because they have great welfare and easy access to it. A woman does not need doesn't need a flashy man, doesn't need a wealthy man, doesn't need, any of this stuff. So patriarchy goes by the wayside. And instead, what she wants is a guy who's going to be nice to her, a guy who's going to please her in bed, a guy who is going to be a good father to his kids, or maybe somebody else's kids that she had, And this, in an immediate return hunter-gatherer society, because there's demand sharing, it's like having a welfare state, okay? And there's no need for territorial management. You don't need a tribal system. I'm from a Moroccan family. My grandfather was a Berber. They lived in the mountains of Marrakesh. I still have in my family, there's clear relics, holdovers from tribal social organization, tribal values, stick together versus the others, rip off, the stranger, deal honestly with your closest relatives, rip off your cousin a little bit less than you'd rip off your second cousin. Anyways, I don't know if this is being coherent. I'm saying that the material conditions of immediate, if Graeber mentioned something like this, but not exactly, but if you read about immediate return hunter-gatherer societies, you will recognize yourself more than you will if you read 15th century Europe, right? If your ancestors, I don't know where your ancestors are from, but let's say, you're from Scotland, you're from Ireland, you're from wherever, Slavic, you're going to see that your ancestors are way more alien to you than the Mbudi Pygmies are, for example. Now, you're not going to relate to everything. There's stuff going on in these hunter-gatherer societies that are alien to us, but we can relate to them a lot more in many levels than we would to our own direct ancestors, most of us. I don't know if that's answered any of the questions, but so if we want to build a future society, what we can learn from these egalitarian societies is that so one of the reasons there's gender equality is because there's a safety net. But the reason there's a safety net is because there's no means to coerce anybody. Okay, if you want to dominate a woman, well, she can just go somewhere else, and she can get food without you. She doesn't need you for food. It helps, but she doesn't need you. It's like being on welfare in Denmark. It's not as great as having a big salary, but you're fine. You're not going to put up with much abuse. She can leave because she's got cousins, friends, relatives all over the place, and she can go anywhere and escape you. And you can't make her hierarchy. You need dependence. You need some person to control resources that other people need. Those resources could be emotional resources. They can be social resources. Usually they're food resources. If you can't control stuff that other people need, then you can't control the people. And who said this? Henry Kissinger said, if you control the food, you control the people, right? That's hierarchy. So if you want to develop a system in the future, we want to make sure that nobody has ways of controlling some of these things in ways that they could use to leverage against everybody else, and with certain kinds of algorithmic technologies, I don't know, but we could imagine more and more. And as people have been writing books about cyber sin from experience in what's it called, Chile, and there's that People's Republic of Walmart book. So people are talking more about how today we have the technology to actually potentially decentralize power in ways that were not possible recently since we lived in hunter-gatherer conditions. Obviously, there's all these anarcho-primitivists who write to me because they're the only ones. Like it's a tragedy to me that on the left nobody knows about these egalitarian hunter-gatherer societies. It's fucked up, and it's such a sign of how up everybody's head is in academia and on the supposed left that we don't know about this. Like, it should be the first thing out of your mouth. But when I encounter somebody who says, oh, well, communism is nice in theory, but it doesn't work. Well, I'm like, fuck, guess what? Our ancestors were all probably egalitarian. Women, men dominate women. No, men don't dominate women. Actually, women can dominate men in many situations. They're like, yeah, bullshit. I'm like, go read this article. And then they do. And then they just look it up and they Google it. And there's a gazillion articles about egalitarianism. And they're like, holy shit, this is real. And I make progress with conservative people. They're surprised when they read this stuff and they have to take it seriously. Unfortunately, now they'll go fucking Google. And now all these, even anarchists are like, oh, well, David Graeber proved that's not true, which is why I fucking hate that book so much. It's so fucking counterproductive. But like, if people wonder like why I'm so demented and like going on and on, but making like 8 episodes against David Graeber, it's because that's what's happened now. When I have these conversations, I used to make progress very quickly, and now I have to have a 45-minute extra conversation to explain why David Graeber is wrong and why no, that's not true, and why the articles that you'll read online about egalitarianism are correct. I forget where I started from and where I'm going, but women's. So, for example, gender. A lot of people ask me about gender. Like, is gender in itself oppression? That's very standard thought today, especially among the younger people younger than everyone here, I think. But I get a lot of that too. And it's interesting because in these egalitarian societies, and which many people argue are gender egalitarian, there's some arguments that they're not. The best, if you want to read the best takedown, once you get into this stuff and you get into all these egalitarian societies, if you want to read the best take, so you want to read 6 societies, but the best takedown of egalitarian societies is by the Unabomber. Ted Kaczynski has a chapter in one of his books called Something About Primitive Societies, Primitive Communism, and all he does is trash these egalitarian societies. Now, I don't actually want you to read that because you don't have the resources to know why most of the stuff he's saying is wrong, but he does the best job of anyone that I've ever seen attacking that stuff. Now, and I was like, holy shit, is this true? This is terrible. But then I went and read about it. I was like, okay, most of the stuff he's saying there's a good explanations for it, or it's not true. Like, for example, in the Kalahari, there are, which is one of the most egalitarian societies, famously, women are supposed to be equal, but then there's a prohibition on pregnant women eating meat. And you're like, wait a second, that's a very huge sign of patriarchy. Especially a pregnant woman is the one who needs meat the most, and you're depriving her of food. And any prohibitions on good food is a sign of patriarchy. Like, if women can't have this, and men can't. But somebody actually in 1990, an article that nobody has read, but he pointed out that, well, in that region, they eat so much protein that if you eat more protein, you get a kind of protein poisoning. And that's extremely dangerous for a fetus and for the woman. So that's actually to protect the woman and the fetus. It's not actually safe. So there's stuff like that. Anyways, whatever, if you ever read this stuff. I'm lost already. I forget what I was talking about. But.
No, that's great. Why don't we pause there? We have another club coming up at 9:30. And so I want to just pause and ask what we want to do. We could go on for another 10 minutes right up to the start of that club. We could end it here. We could go in. I don't know how we feel about going into the other club a little bit. And I don't know what your time is, Daniel. How much more time do you want to give us?
I got a dentist appointment at 9:30 p.m. I'm fine. I'm good. I'm here.
You good till 9:30?
No, I'm joking. I'm here till whenever it's like.
Okay.
Yeah, there's nothing. It's nighttime. I don't go anywhere.
All right. Cool. So what do you want to do, Jim? You're the host of the next club.
I guess in the interest of being egalitarian, I would put it to the group. I didn't anticipate the potential for this, which is kind of dropping the ball on my part.
Neither did I, Jim.
But I guess when we get closer to 9:30, if it looks like we're going to go a little bit later, we can. I can drop something in the Discord and just ask people whether they want to join this, or if people want to stick with the classic meeting.
Why don't you do this? Why don't you do this, Jim? Why don't you drop that in there right now? Let people know we're still going on with this, and see what they think.
Okay, cool. Yeah.
And for now, we'll keep talking. I want to jump off what you were saying, Daniel, about gender patriarchy and gender dynamics. in your podcast, I just re-listened to your podcast episode 7.1 on the pink pill. And I think it's relevant. What are the material conditions that led to the change from group marriage within a tribe to women being married off to other tribes, thus decreasing their bargaining power? I might put that a little differently. I think my understanding of that is a little sketchy.
Okay, yeah. So when you're talking about group marriage, you're getting that from Engels, and that's one of the things that's actually just wrong.
Okay.
Although it's not 100% wrong, but you'll see what I mean. But it's you don't. That's going to confuse you and give you some terrible idea of like this weird orgy that everyone's just marrying each other and screwing each other's spouses. That's not. There's no one does that as far as we know, and there's no reason to think that happened in the past. Though there's a little bit of. Anyways, I'll get into it. Okay, so there's natural locality, bilocality, and patrilocality, and there's other forms too, which we'll talk about. Now, let's go back. When you want to have babies with somebody, you don't want to do a lot of incest because it's bad. The reasons that you all know, genetic reasons. Although in Roman, peasants used to all have sex with their brothers and sisters, and so did Greek monarchs. And after 4 or 5 generations of having terrible birth defects, they'll be weeded out and you'll have normal kids. But it's not good. Genetic diversity is very important. This is the reason that we have the sex differentiation to begin with, because there's a species who just have asexual reproduction where they just kind of clone themselves. But that you get one virus or one conditions change and the whole fucking race dies out. And you need genetic diversity so that when conditions change, some people will survive. Oh, well, I'm not well adapted to this climate because I'm a little bit short or I'm a little bit tall. But, climate changes quickly or environments change and now I'm doing great. And then all the people who are doing great before are dying. Anyways, I'm all over the place. So we don't want to marry our sisters. We want to have genetic diversity. How do we do that? Well, it means that somebody is going to have to, the husband or wife is going to have to marry, somebody's going to have to marry outside of the group where they grew up in to marry somebody else somewhere else. Now, especially in sedentary society, but this applies to nomadic societies a little bit. It's easier to explain in sedentary society. That means either the man has to go live with the women's people or the woman has to go live with the man's people. Or they can go move somewhere else, like in the frontier times, for example, like you just go, and over like today, you kind of move away from nobody goes, you don't go live with your wife's parents usually, or vice versa. You go out on your own somewhere, but not everybody. And there's 6 different ways of doing this. But we won't get into them. We're just going to get into 3 easier ones, which are natural locality, where the man goes to live with the women's people, patrilocality, where the women go with the father's people, and then there's ambilocality, where you just go live wherever, okay, and often live back and forth. And in ambilocality, you tend to first live with the mother's people and then later live with the father's people. But this has huge implications, evolutionary implications, and implications for women's status. And we should get into this. So, immediate return hunter-gatherers tend to live with their mothers. The man will go live with the mother's people and do something that's called bride service, where to show that he's worthy of their daughter and that he's not a goof and that he's worth having babies with, he's got to go hunt and be a good provider for her and her parents and her family. And so they'll spend the first years usually living with the mother's family. And eventually maybe they'll go live with his family and back and forth. And people are just moving all over the place in these societies. Now, when you get to a sedentary society, there's not so much moving all over the place, right? Because you have territories to control and your family has a territory like the Iroquois on the Sine. You got your family, your clan has this, that's where your land is. If you don't have a clan, you have nothing, right? You can't eat without your clan. Fuck, man, you guys really want to get into identity politics and why it's so pernicious and so powerful. It has a lot to do with territoriality and needing to identify with a group because your group is your livelihood. Now, why do we, if we have this egalitarian path, why do we have this innate capacity for identity groups? Fuck, I don't know if people have time to talk about it, but it's very super interesting. I'm making an episode about it. So if you have a sedentary society and men go to live with the women, now There are material reasons for why you're going to choose. So when you're choosing something, you're choosing it because A, it's better, or because the people who have disproportionate power is better for them, right? Capitalism is not better. It's better for the people, or the millions of policies that we have are not better for all of us. They're just, private healthcare is not better for everybody. It's better for a small slice of people. They happen to have all the power. So we all, or you in the States, all have private healthcare, right? So why do societies end up with natural locality, where you move in with your wife's family? And why do some societies have patrilocality? Well, they found that patrilocality happens where the wife moves to the husband's family when your society is frequently has to defend itself from attackers. So classic is like you're a pastoralist society, you herd animals, and people are always trying to rustle your cattle. Cattle rustlers, the real thing. Every pastoralist society has someone trying to steal your camels, steal your cattle. And you're constantly having to defend yourself. And the best way to defend yourself, because men are on average 15% larger than women, have bigger muscles and whatever, don't have to nurse babies or be pregnant, they're less vulnerable less of the time. They're strong. Women can be stronger than men, can be more athletic, can be warriors, all that stuff. But if you have to choose, who are you going to have as the locus of your society if you're frequently under attack? Men is a better choice. And men also will end up with more bargaining power, because since they're stronger, you will need them more, right? So societies that are frequently under attack typically choose patrilocality. So you have a group of brothers, and it's also to prevent conflict. Like your defense team, your military is all the boys, your boys, your bros who have grown up together. Everyone in your natal village you've known for your entire life. All your male cousins, your male brothers, your male uncles, okay? And all the women, what that means is a situation where all the boys have grown up together, know each other, are tight, and all the women come from competing tribes. You're often marrying your enemy tribes, because genetic diversity is so important that we marry our enemies. Like that's a whole other thing, right? Literally, you're the enemies that you fight to the death. That's who your wife often comes from in a lot of societies, okay? So you have a society, core of the village is all these dudes that grew up together, and all these women that did not grow up together, that grew up from different villages, who are the enemy of the dudes' families, right? So they're hostile intruders. Sometimes they're not hostile intruders, but it's more exaggerated and easier to explain the dynamics. Guess who's going to win if there's a battle between a man and a wife? What's going to happen is, let's say a man and a wife fight, the woman hits the man. He's got 12 of his bros nearby who come and go beat her up or kill her, right? And when you have a society where there's a disproportionate balance of power, ideology, like if you're a rock star, if you're Michael Jackson, and nobody ever tells you, hey, you're getting ridiculous with all your plastic surgeries, or your Sting, and you're like, hey, your music was better with the Police because the drummer was punching you in the face when you sucked, but now nobody's telling you that you suck and your shit is getting crappy. You become more and more of an asshole and more of a dick, and your ideology becomes more and more self-serving, right? Because no one's there to tell you any different. Because if a woman tells the men, like, you guys are just fucking a bunch of assholes, you're not any better than us, you're going to beat her up, and there's no consequences for her because there's nobody to defend her, right? So you have all these dudes and all these women who are outsiders who don't have any allies, right? And so there's an enormous power imbalance between men and women. And you already have Lewis Henry Morgan pointing this out. I think maybe Engels talks about it too in the book. This is something we've known for like 150 years. You won't learn this in anthropology school anymore. Like, where does patriarchy come from? That's seen like as this giant mystery. It's not a mystery. I mean, there's different roads to patriarchy. There's different ways that men can get advantages over women historically, but this is like the classic example that is so obvious and easy to explain. Good luck learning that in any recent text, but it's very fun. And in David Graeber's book, they're like, "Gee, we're just starting to figure out where male dominance comes from." Like, this is old, easy to explain shit. Now, there's the other way around too. In different situations, 16% of societies are matrilocal, where the men go and live with the women, right? And we saw that in the consequences of the women moving to the men's village are male dominance, patriarchy. Our ancient Hebrews and the Old Testament, all that patriarchy stuff comes straight out of that. Bedouin society is like that. That people are like, oh, why are some of these societies so patriarchal? Afghanistan, it's because they have that. Yeah, sorry.
Question. Well, why only, did you say 16% or matrilineal? Why only 16?
I don't know, because it's less frequent. Okay, so I'll explain to you why do people choose matrilineal? Why does it happen? Okay, when your society requires the men to go, and these are sedentary societies. So let me get back to what happens in a hunter-gatherer, egalitarian, nomadic society. Why are the women equal? Why don't they get dominated by the men? Because they can just leave. And if your husband and wife fight in any society, and often it's reported a woman hits a man. But guess what? The man, like for example, some of the pygmy societies, the anthropologist Marlowe mentioned, he's seen a woman hit a man many times. He's never seen a man hit his wife. Okay? That's not in every society, but that's in them. Why? Because if he hits her, her brother is nearby. Her male cousin is nearby. There's some strong dude and dudes, and other women are nearby. Her mother is nearby. Her grandmother is nearby. All of her people, or a lot of her people, are there. So they can kill you and beat you up. And more than just killing, beat you up, just make your life hell in various ways. They can excommunicate you, which is a huge thing. And there are gendered organizations in all of these societies, these egalitarian societies, to defend their gender interests. And the women's organizations are very powerful. And they will expel men for not just violating women's rights, but also just for violating the rights of the traditions of the group. For example, there's a man who hunts too much, and they don't mention, people should, even if you're a great hunter, you shouldn't do it too much, because if you do, you could become like too authoritative. You could have too much influence, and that's seen as very bad. So, and it's very disruptive for someone to have disproportionate influence. So this guy just refused to stop hunting because he loved it so much and he was so good at it. And he was bringing back a lot of food. But this is in Jerome Lewis's Egalitarian Society. But the women's organization banished him because he just wouldn't stop, and they thought he was a threat to the social order. So they kicked him out. Anyhow, so matrilineal. I forget the percentages of patrilineal societies is more frequent. Matrilineal societies, matrilocal societies, sorry. Husband goes to the woman's family. That tends to happen when the economy or war requires men to go on long distance trips for long periods. For example, you have to go on a long distance fishing expedition for half the year or for 2 months every year, or you have to go fight the Iroquois and the Wendat. A lot of the stuff you'll see in that Engels book is when they talk about the matrilineal, forget how they put it, they're talking about women, organized societies organized about women's clans. And the reason for that is the men had to go fight wars for long periods every year and also go on hunting expeditions far away. So what does that do is, first of all, it's more efficient and practical for the women to run things because they're the ones in town most of the time. And never mind whether it's more practical, because men might decide, well, I don't want women to run things. I don't like that. But guess what? You're away for 6 months of the year. Fuck you. We're going to do what we want because we're here. We have bargaining leverage that you don't have because you're away. And it also creates less conflict when the people governing the society are the ones who are closely related, right? Versus if you had a patrilocal society where the men are away for 6 months of the year, well, all these women would be women from different tribes who might have conflicting interests and hatreds of each other, and they don't know each other very well, so they wouldn't cooperate very well, and it would cause a lot of chaos. So what in these societies, what general pattern, and every society is a bit different, but the general pattern that you see, and which you saw in the Engels book, is that women control local politics and men control long distance politics. So the leaders, the positions of authority are the clan mothers, which are the oldest living women, usually, of a clan. And the clan mothers choose a male chief, and the chief's duty, so the women manage the domestic affairs, and the male chief is the one who has authority over war, peace, trade, things to do with the outsiders, right? And the women actually arguably have more power because they can just ditch the male chief whenever they want. The clan mothers don't like the male chief, they just ditch him and elect a new one. Although men can be said to have more power because the average woman doesn't actually have a vote. The average man has a vote, but they're voting in affairs. Women don't have a vote, men have a vote, but the authority figures are all women except for the chief. It's complicated. So there's debate about whether these societies are matriarchal or not. I would say they're not. If anything, they're egalitarian, or there's a balance where it's a bit more male dominated. And as we get closer to the present in history, some of the dynamics of colonialism and European wars and invasions gave men certain advantages more than they had had before. Women had more authority over trade earlier, and then men ended up more and more having more dominance over trade over time, which gave them more bargaining power for women. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So that has huge dynamics. So patriarchy and matriarchy have a lot of dynamics in terms of who has a balance of power. Patrilocality gives men an enormous balance of power. Matrilocality gives women maybe an egalitarian balance of power, but you see that women have much more rights, much more freedom, much more respect. But there's also these other things that you'll see in matrilocal societies, like you'll see like on weird OkCupid or Tinder surveys, they've discovered like the ideal age that a man, no matter what age you are, you want a 22-year-old woman, apparently, according to who's swiping what, whatever, right? Like if you're a 22-year-old man, you want a 22-year-old woman. Or 45-year-old man, you want a 22-year-old woman. Well, in matrilineal societies, it's, if you talk to like somebody who's Seneca person or Mohawk person, the ideal woman is like in her late 30s and early 40s, right? Because she's the one who has authority and status, right? So you're more attractive. Like it changes gender dynamics. And if you are a patrilineal society, the man wants to control because property is being passed down from man to man, right? And the women are outsiders. You want to make sure that your kids are your kids. So your wife can't be away from your sight for any moment because you don't trust her, right? And if she has sex with anyone, you kill her. And it's like all this biblical stuff. It's just horrible. All this patriarchal stuff comes from patrilocality in so many ways. But in a matrilocal society, women have much more sexual freedom. They have lovers. They have, there's no policing because you don't care. All your kids are your kids. Doesn't matter if you have 7 dads or if you have 1 dad, right? And it's kind of better to have 7 dads because your kids are going to have allies from all these different guys, and your social network is going to be much bigger. And a patrilocal social network is tiny because all the brothers and sisters are against each other because your sisters are going to join an enemy clan, an enemy tribe. So you don't have that social network. I forget, but basically your sphere of network is much, much narrower, and there's much more conflict between all the groups. In a matrilineal society, your social network is much bigger. And that's one of the reasons why we think that early human societies, there's an article called Early Human Kinship Was Matrilineal by Chris Knight, and it's also subtitles Engels Was Right. And his thing is that, and there's a book by Sarah Hrdy called Mothers and Others. Now, chimpanzees, like why do humans have such big brains, right? It would be advantageous for chimpanzees to have bigger brains, but the fact is that chimpanzees, only the mother raises their children. She will never let anyone else touch her kids for very long because anyone else is kind of her competitor and is likely to kill or harm the kids, right? But humans, well, your grandmother, your mother's mother is very important in raising the kid. The fact that you have not just the grandmother, but uncles, aunts, friends, you let your other people raise their kids. And actually, immediate return hunter-gatherer camps are described as giant daycares. Now, we trust strangers with our kids, and that's how we're able to have such giant brains, because the amount of calories that it takes to feed a child, it's not possible for a single mother to provide a kid with that amount of calories. 13 million calories. This is a book called Mothers and Others. But humans, well, we're getting food from all kinds of people. So basically to say that if you're a woman and you have like 7 boyfriends or whatever, more likely 2 or 3, and nobody knows exactly who their son is, well, they take care of all the kids, and they see that their wife's kid or their lover's kid is their kid too. And they show that men will raise kids that they know are not related to them. There's all these statistics about, stepfathers murder their children more, neglect their children more. Well, these are societies with patrilineal, patrilocal histories. In these matrilineal societies, men are constantly raising kids that are not their own. So the whole dynamics are completely different. So ancient human societies, as I mentioned earlier, in the Paleolithic era, were spread. You see this technology that's similar spread across thousands of miles, okay, from like Asia to like whatever, Africa. And that probably couldn't exist unless you had matrilineal social or it wouldn't be totally matrilineal, but it would be relative matrilineal social organization, which is what we see in the immediate return hunter-gatherers. And we probably couldn't have big brains unless we had matrilineal social organization. And matrilineal social organization doesn't always equal female equality, but it usually does, especially in a hunter-gatherer context. So these are some of the reasons why we think that we were immediate return hunter-gatherers, and that women's equality, gender equality was the norm for much of our history, at least. I would say that it would shift, because I think, so if you look at them, because we wonder, why did agriculture start 10,000 years ago or so? Why was there no agriculture? We were around for 300,000 years, but agriculture is only 10,000 years old, about whatever, 12. It's because there was a giant climate change that happened. That we went from the Pleistocene geological era to the Holocene. And before, which is 12,000 years ago, before in the Pleistocene, where we emerged there 300,000 years ago, and we lived 90% of our existence in that era. The climate was changing radically every 20, 30, 40 years, right? So everything was just changing all the time. So that's why humans are such a jack of all trades, master of none species, because we had to deal with this constantly changing climate. It's not like we just stayed in some like corner of a jungle for a million years. And then also, this is me theorizing, though, but when times were better, we probably had matrilocal egalitarian societies. And then when there were squeezes, we probably reverted to more tribalistic, more patrilineal, because there's more conflict societies. And I bet we were going back and forth throughout all the time, which is why we have the proclivities for both. So when we want to design a future society, we want to keep all this shit in mind. That's why I think this stuff is so important. It's not just interesting to, because we're all just guessing sort of about the past, but we want to, how can we trigger our best natures and not our worst natures? That's something we want to think about when we're building a social institution. So yeah,
great
stuff to go around.
That's a lot of fascinating stuff. Let's go to Andrew with a question, but I just want to say let's end it at 10 in 12 minutes or so. I'm starting to fade. Andrew,
sorry.
No, it's great.
A blathery disposition. Yeah,
I'll listen to it again when I'm editing it, and I'll probably absorb more.
Hi, Daniel. I have a question about, I guess, when people talk about, it's not human to do X, Y, or Z, but as you've shown that, like, there's so many tribes out there across the world. But I wonder, is there anyone who is like compiled? I know the guy from, what's it called? Probably Like an Animal podcast. He recommended, I think it's called the Universal Human. Do you know if there's any book that because I know you're bringing out how the egalitarian tribes, is there a percentage number to how many tribes were these tribes? And And then, last thing was just I guess that typical freshman anthropology question is what is what makes humans human, I guess? Especially because it seems like we're just mainly adapting to our conditions. But I wonder if there's any pretty strong universals that have run throughout.
Are there core features that every single human has, basically? That's what you're asking?
Yeah, sort of. Especially in regards to how one person can bring up, this tribe does this, and they killed it, and the other person's egalitarian. Yeah. So
that book, there's, if you guys are interested in this, there's an episode of Fight Like an Animal podcast where Arnold basically reads from this book called Human Universals that you just mentioned. And he describes, I think there's 50 sort of things that he listed that all humans have. So marriage, so some biological stuff that's simple, besides everyone having 2 arms and 2 legs, but we all have the exact same facial expressions, no matter what culture you're from. Papua New Guinea people who have never been contacted before, you tickle them, they make smiles and laughs the same that you'll recognize immediately. Somebody smells a poo-poo and they make a disgust face, everywhere around the world, whether they've had contact or not. These are clearly genetically programmed facial expressions, which is another indication of an egalitarian past, I would say, because in other species, you'll notice, for example, chimpanzees do not have very expressive faces, and dogs and things, they have very limited expressions. They have a weird smile, which is don't kill me smile, and sometimes you could tell they're angry because they're beating their chest or they're doing this or that. You can't hide, most people are shit liars, right? But if we were in a competitive society where it's each against all, you would be great poker faces. We'd all be amazing poker faces. It's a disadvantage for you to show you blushing, right? Why are you blushing? You know that you just told a lie or that you're embarrassed and you have a crush on somebody and she's around. So all these tells are because it's actually more adaptive to for everybody to know how everybody is feeling on a group level than for each person to be protecting their own, poker face. The other thing is it's called the cooperative eye. If you look at other primates, they have the whites of their eyes. They're either not white, or there's only a tiny little area that's white, but usually it's like brown, it's dark. So you can't really see where they're looking at any given time. So that's masking your intention, masking what you're going to do. What am I looking at? So humans have unusually visible, and we're always looking at each other's eyes. What's he looking at? What's she looking at? What is he, what was he really focusing on? So we're always going to read each other's minds. That's wouldn't make sense in a competitive hierarchical society. It makes more sense in an evolutionary context in an egalitarian society. Now, what are some universals? Fuck. God, I don't know that. Go read that book. There's like 50 of them. Marriage, sex stuff. But here's something, again, a gendered division of labor. And this is like sort of controversial, especially with younger people, is the fact that, gender is universal as far as we know. And gendered division of labor is universal as far. Is that proof of inequality? Now, there's arguments on both sides, but people who are in favor of saying that these societies are equal. So if you look at Neanderthal skeleton bones, you'll find that there is no gendered division of labor. Men and women were doing the same stuff. Okay. And if you look at human bones, there was gendered division of labor, even like 50,000 years ago, whenever we have some decent skeletons. The reason that people still think that, so in an immediate return hunter-gatherer society, super egalitarian ones, there's gendered division of labor. But what's different between them and more male-dominated societies is that the gendered division of labor isn't a rule. It's a suggestion. It's a convenience, right? Most men will be doing men's stuff most of the time. Most women will be doing the women's work most of the time. But a lot of times men will be doing women's stuff and most people will have done men's and women's work frequently as well when it's convenient. Oh, there's no guy around. I need to do this. I'm going to go hunt, and women hunt frequently big game, although it depends on what kind of hunting they do. And I would think it's just practical. Long expeditions tend to be male only. But there's a lot of kinds of hunting, like net hunting, where women will hunt and they'll even be the hunting leaders and stuff like that. But some kind of division of labor, and it's believed that humans probably outcompeted Neanderthals because division of labor inherently tends to be more efficient. So probably that was one of the reasons why we outcompeted Neanderthals. Is that an indication of male dominance? I don't think so. As long as women, there's nothing stopping women from doing men's work. And there's a good video by Helga Vierich, I forget what it's called, but she talks about there's, because people are asking her about gender roles and oppression. And she's saying there's a woman who in the Kalahari foragers, it was believed that shaman were always men. And it was thought that that's maybe a sign of male dominance. But she met a woman shaman and nobody blinked. Nobody said anything. She was just a shaman. She wanted to be a shaman. She was a shaman. For some reason, mostly men choose to be shamans, but she chose and nobody looked at her twice. There was a group of gay men, like men who weren't married and living together, and nobody blinked because people preferred to live in their in their band because they were two hunting guys. They were good hunting guys, so they had even a little bit of an extra status than regular guys. So yeah. Oh, there's a hand up. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention to that. Yeah.
So I don't know. There's some interesting implications in some of the stuff even saying about how the climate influenced, whether resources were scarce or widely available, whether that influenced. I'm sort of extrapolating whether societies would be in conflict with each other, and therefore the sort of gender egalitarian societal structure that created at a given moment. And it sounds like this period of this Pleistocene climate crossover or period of climate instability was actually conducive, you said, to I don't know, matrilineal, matrilocal societies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is the converse statement that a period of like relative climate stability was actually conducive to, like say agriculture, and therefore the ability to hoard resources, to also the genetic bottleneck, which I think you alluded to earlier, that occurred with agriculture. Yeah. I don't know if you had anything to say about that.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but what are you going to say again?
No, just whether you had any, comments on that. And then I guess I'm also thinking into the future about like, what climate change and that sort of instability is going to look like for, I don't know, from your perspective in light of what you know.
Okay, so let me talk about the past, so we know more about it than the future. So yes, so the reason there wasn't agriculture before 12,000 years ago, I was saying, is because probably there wasn't enough nitrogen in the atmosphere or in the soil, I forget, and because climate change was too unstable, so that if you planted some crops, 15 years later they'd all die. Like it wasn't a good strategy. So you see some experiments with agriculture like 23,000 years ago, but they never last very long, longer than a generation. Okay. So, but after all of a sudden you have all this stability. So before the Holocene, if you had a period of scarcity, well, you either had to starve to death or fight somebody, or, figure out some other way to figure out some new strategy. All of a sudden with the climate, with the Holocene, you could start farming. Farming sucks. It's not as much. There's a lot of reasons why farming is worse than hunting and gathering in general, but it's better than dying and starving, right? So, and once you start farming, well, then you get into more territoriality. And early agricultural settlements were egalitarian as well. But I think as time went on and there's more competition for land and there's more land scarcity, they become more and more hierarchical over time. I'd say male dominated as well. And so, yes, the climate stability allowed for agriculture, which allows, at first, agriculture was most likely very egalitarian. But once you get into conditions, so like in my videos, I talk about like the formula for hierarchy is having some people able to control resources that other people need. Well, in the hunter-gatherer Pleistocene environment, there weren't many situations where you had that. Sometimes, yeah, but not. Once you're in an agricultural situation and there's enough population density and scarcity, you get those conditions more and more. So yeah, but it's important to think that hoarding resources can be that's why I think civilization is compatible with egalitarianism, because hunter-gatherers, in a sense, they've got tons of resource hoarding. It's just that they don't need to collect it's like, we go to the fridge, or like the Haudenosaunee had their longhouses with all these, all their yams or whatever in it, and they store it, and you can defend that from other people, and you could like say, well, you're not getting any unless you're a good boy or whatever. Hunter-gatherers have storage, except nature stores everything. The fridge is just the tree that's right there, right? They have tons of abundance, and they kind of are better off usually than their agricultural neighbors. So there's tons of surplus. Sorry, that's the word. They have tons of surplus. It's just that they can't control access to the surplus the same way that you can with agriculture. So yeah, there is that. But I think that at the same time, it's like I'm getting into like this Marxist vision where I think that with the abundance that we're able to create with civilization, we're creating situations where we don't need to hoard stuff anymore, and where with all these algorithms, we can decentralize and power can be more spread out more equally if we start thinking about how to do that carefully. And so there's definitely a possibility, I think, for egalitarian future, much more egalitarian future. Climate change, holy fuck, I don't know. If I want to put a silver lining on it, here's what I think. And I think someone asked in the questions before, like, what should we be doing, if we want to have a better world? It's like a crazy question to ask anybody. Who the fuck is going to answer that question? Well, I can answer that question because I'm crazy. So I think the thing we should be doing is spreading egalitarian ideas to the general public, not because we're always just talking to educated, university people, which I think are a shitty class. Now, we don't have time to get into class analysis, but that tends to be the people who are the most into socialism and understand all this stuff the best, but they're also like a shitty, unreliable class of people that you can't and they're too small to like get anything done. Okay. So we have to talk to normal fucking people, average people. And my videos haven't been doing that much. I'm going to be transitioning to doing that stuff more. But the idea is ideas float around in the air. And then when there's a crisis, when there's some kind of material change, people realize like the balance of power change, material conditions change, but sometimes we don't realize it. And then some event happens that shakes things up and gives people the opportunity to organize in new ways and do new things. And if the ideas that everybody has in their head is just garbage, which is currently the case, if there's a giant crisis, whether it's climate crisis or some more virus or economic collapse, the shit that's going to happen is going to be garbage. It's going to be fascist garbage. It's going to be authoritarian garbage. It's going to be nationalistic garbage. It's going to be capitalist libertarian garbage. These are the ideas that are the common sense floating around among people today. So what we want is to have, and like, I have a video criticizing Occupy Wall Street. They had a lot of good ideas, but they had a lot of garbage, which comes from academia and being a middle class, children. But if we can get egalitarian ideas to be simple, easy to understand, common sense, when shit happens, the common sense will be egalitarian, the common sense will be socialistic, and people will make better decisions in the crisis. I think that's something that we can do. That's my job. That's what I see as my job. I mean, we all have something different. You can work on your environment, you work on all kinds of stuff. This is what I think I can do. And I think a lot of people should work on communicating with your average person. So I'm going to be doing a bunch of videos on how to, why socialism will solve all of Jordan Peterson's problems. 1 minute TikTok videos just explaining all kinds of things in easy ways. No gibberish, no jargon. That's it.
And I think that's what's great about your project and your podcast and YouTube channel is that like you're trying to clarify these things. You're trying to put it in a way that anybody could understand. And it's the kind of thing that I like had the impulse to show to my to make my conservative mom listen to, who is like hostile to anything vaguely left wing. And she'd probably be hostile to it just by the fact that I'm sharing it with her. But it's, I still had that impulse. And I commend you for that. Keep up the good work.
I think at this phase, what I'm doing is clarifying things for the educated, socialist-minded type people, which is good. It's important because we have to not have our heads be a complete muddle, which we do. So that's like sort of phase one. But beyond that, that's all. I think we're the kind of people who have a lot of power because we have a lot of knowledge. But we have to reach outside of our group, And so phase two is reach to the conservative people, because so many people who think that this is something that Arnold Schroeder talks about. And I guess we don't have to talk about now, but that conservative and liberal are dispositions. They're not political. They are genetic. There's a lot of evidence that these are genetic dispositions. But you can have people with a conservative disposition who are radical communists, and you had that 150 years ago. It was very common. But today, marketers have learned to market liberal ideas to liberal. What we call liberal ideas to liberalish people and conservative ideas, but they're just marketing mechanisms. They're not political content. So there are ways to, and if you talk to a conservative, a person who calls themselves right-wing or conservative, they believe 80% of the same stuff you do. They might be kind of more racist, more sexist, and they might have some ideas that are really shitty, but on a lot of important things, they think the exact same thing that we do. And we're not communicating with those people. It's because we don't know how to talk to them in a language that they can understand. And we can get across feminist ideas to sexist people. You can get across all this stuff if you have the right way of talking about it. If you can have a hook that will get that person to realize that you are on the same team as them and the issues that matter to them more than their stupid social grievances and hating wokeness or whatever it is. Yeah.
Great. Agreed. Let's end it there.